paperwork before.
Good, so they're familiar with it.
They are familiar
Good,
with it.
good.
I don't know if that frees us up to start, because you have a pretty heavy schedule after that, so.
We will be very quick, so we can wait a few minutes.
So we'll do the finance first and then the
I said
water?
we will be very quick, so.
Yeah, because we don't have that on our agenda until 2:30, but, yeah, I'd hate to get into the budget discussion without, their being present or able to participate, but could we change the order of the agenda in terms of proceeding to, like, the approval of the minutes, and then doing the election of officers when they're not here to object?
Greg,
That's at the discretion of the
I think we've
chair.
set a public hearing at a specific time, so we'll probably have to do that.
Okay.
Hearing as close to 2 o'clock as possible.
All right, well, then I will go ahead and call the Lower Smoky Hill Water Supply Access District Incorporated Board meeting to order, and we will start with a roll call.
Mayor Hodges.
Here.
Commissioner Davis.
Here.
Commissioner Hoppick. Oh, he's not here. Commissioner Peck.
Here?
Commissioner Ryan.
Here?
All right, and for those who watch these Lower Smoky Hill Water Supply Access District meetings, we are hoping to have two of our other members, Tom Toll and Carl Esping, be able to join us shortly via Zoom. And with that in mind, I would propose that we change the order of the agenda somewhat and adjust it so that we start with the approval of minutes, proceed to new business, and then go back to the public hearing on our amended budget, if that suits the other members of the commission.
It does.
Certainly.
All right. Then we will start with the approval of minutes. Item 3.1, approval of the May 3rd, 2021 minutes. Are there any additions, corrections to those minutes?
Yep.
I move we approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the minutes of May 3rd, 2021. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Motion passes 5-0. And that will take us to new business. Item 4.1, election of officers. President, Vice President, Secretary, and Treasurer. Ms. Tasker very helpfully gave me a cheat sheet. In terms of what we've done in the past, generally the mayor serves as the president of the board, and we have one of the irrigators, Mr. Toll or Mr. Esping, serve as vice president, and then another commissioner as treasurer, generally the vice mayor, and the other agriculture representative as the secretary. And the slate that Martha has proposed following that precedent would be for Commissioner Davis to be president, Tom Toll as vice president, Commissioner Ryan as treasurer, and Mr. Esping as secretary. Are there any nominations or any discussion on that slate of officers? I mean, Commissioner Ryan, if you want to go for it and be president, and
I'm
now's your time.
satisfied with the recommendation. Fine to me.
You probably know more about water than I do.
Well, I would
move
comment
we-
that I appreciate, I think it was Mr. Brinkson that put together the cover memo, and I don't know that I've seen all of that in one place before, and that was
Greatly appreciated.
interesting
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
to see the history.
It was a privilege to present it.
Okay, I move we approve the election of officers as previously stated.
Second.
All right, we have a motion to accept the following slate of officers. Commissioner Davis, President, Mr. Toll, Vice President, Commissioner Ryan, Treasurer, and Mr. Esping, Secretary. All those in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Motion passes 5-0.
We have Carl on now.
Oh, great. Congratulations, Mr. Esping. You've just been elected to the Board of Directors for next year. I don't know if you can hear me. I would too. I would too. Let's see what else we can get done before he. Mr. Esping, are you there?
It doesn't look like his mic's connected.
Oh, so like he has,
Does he know sign language?
yeah. Yeah. Can you hear us, Carl?
Don't think he can.
Hang on. Let's see here.
Something's trying to warm up.
Turn your volume up.
Okay, now,
Oh, now he is.
Plug your speaker in there. He's
Yeah.
got a mute.
he should be able to hear you.
Can you hear us, Carl?
Oh, he's talking.
Oh, we have to unmute him.
Probably has to unmute himself there.
How's that?
Hey, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yeah, doing real good. Talked to Tom, he's out and about, so he won't be joining us.
Okay, well, in the what we did prior to your arrival is that we did accept the following slate of officers for next year. Commissioner Davis as president, Tom Toll as vice president, Commissioner Ryan as treasurer, and you as secretary. So congratulations. I hope I hope that's agreeable to you.
Oh, I'll speak to my campaign chairman after a while.
All right, so let's go back and we will go to item 2.1, the public hearing of the 2021 amended budget, and 2.1A, approval of the 2021 amended budget.
The 2021 budget is being amended due to the decision to prepay the 3-year insurance policy in 2021 for $24.87. So that budget is being amended from $175,910 to $176,498.
And that's the only
change.
That's the only change? Do we have a motion to approve the amended budget?
I move we approve the amended 2021 budget.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the 2021 amended budget. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Item 2.2, the public hearing of the 2022 budget.
Does the mayor need to close the public hearing?
Oh, thank you for catching that. Well, if I do, the public hearing is now closed, and we will begin the public hearing for the 2022 budget.
Thank you. Debbie Pack, Director of Finance. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself before. The 2022 budget is being proposed as expenditures of $132,953. This includes the changes that were provided by the Water District for O&M and the A&E for the shares from the irrigators and the municipality. There haven't been any changes from what we discussed at our last meeting, so I would just offer that as the final proposed budget for 2022.
Any questions?
Nope.
Just to repeat, he said there was no changes
Not
at our
since,
last meeting.
that's correct.
Good.
And I don't see any members from the public, either in person or online. I should have asked for public input, but doesn't look like we have anyone here to speak on this. So I'll bring it back to the board for action.
I move we approve the budget for 2022 as written.
Second.
And I guess did it again. We'll close the
Close the
public
hearing.
hearing, and we'll proceed with our vote to adopt the 2022 budget. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. All right. So I think the only thing that we have left to discuss is the next meeting date.
No, I didn't pick a date. Do we have to do anything for budget?
Oh, and do,
No.
actually, should I have turned this over to Commissioner Davis since he's the newly elected chair?
You're doing great.
Just done that on
Well,
record.
all we have to do is set a meeting, so I feel pretty good about that. Carl, do you have any sense of when would be a good time for you to meet, and when do we need to meet, like, statutorily next?
Statutorily, the requirements that you meet at least once each quarter. So,
Okay, so that would be the third quarter, fourth quarter?
Before the end of September?
No, in the fourth quarter would be September through,
December.
When would be our third quarter meeting then? This is the second quarter meeting.
yeah,
get a date straight, I guess.
yeah, technically, we would need to meet at some time during the third quarter.
Which will be July, August, September?
Yes.
Yeah, we have effectively had 2 during the second quarter to get the budget taken
Get the
care of,
budget
but
in, okay.
we don't get credit for 2.
Carl, are there harvest considerations to take into account?
The next 2 to 3 weeks is when action's gonna be happening. So, we're fine. Meet anytime in August is usually earlier. First week or 2 of August would be fine.
It'd be August 2nd or August 9th?
Just my suggestion.
I know I won't be in town the 9th, so the second, I'm just one person, but second would,
Actually, and I'm not going to be in town that week as well, so it sounds like we need to do the second.
I'll be in on
Well,
TV,
what's
but it's,
Yeah.
but it's,
Do we
All
need a
right.
motion for that?
I
I
think we-
move that we set our next Lower Smoky Hill Water Supply Access District meeting for August 2nd,
Second.
2021.
We have a motion and a second to set August 2nd, 2021 as our next meeting date. Would that meeting time be at 2 o'clock, or is it too early to say on that?
It's too early to say at this point.
Too early to say at this point. Okay, so we'll keep everybody posted in terms of what the time's going to be on that. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Is there any unfinished or other business that we have to discuss? Anything from you, Mr. Esping?
I think we're fine, thank you.
Okey dokey. All right.
Move we adjourn.
second.
We, motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned.
We do have some documents for the 5 of you to sign for the budget. If-
Okay, cool. Martha, do you want your cheat sheet back? Okay. All right, thank you. All right, welcome to the June 14th 2021 budget study session for our 2022 budget. I will turn it over to Mr. Sprague or Ms. Pack, whoever's going to lead us through this today.
I'll kick it off and quickly turn it over to Debbie again, but this is next step in the budget process. We had some conversation last week about fund balances and American Rescue Plan, trying to get into a little bit more detail about not only the fund balances, but proposed allocations and creation of unbudgeted funds to better track some of those dedications of funds, as well as walk you through the American Rescue Plan, all with the intention of maybe trying to reach some consensus on use of those funds going forward. And then next week, one of our points of focus will be revenue estimates. If we can all kind of agree on the assumptions behind the revenue estimates, that then gives staff a target to try to start balancing the budget to and bring that back to you at a future date. So Debbie's got a lot of good information here. We've poured over it as staff and look forward to walking you through it.
Thank you, Mike. Debbie Pack, Director of Finance. So today, what we've tried to do is put probably more in here than we could ever cover, because we want to make sure that we're utilizing all of our time as we go through these budget study sessions, because we're with the July 15th deadline to report back to the county on the revenue neutral rate. We're trying to get as much information before you as we can in order to make those decisions. So if we don't get through this, it's not surprising to us. So we'll just continue it next Monday. So today we're going to look over the CIP request that we had for the 2022 budget. As Mike mentioned, the usage of some of the fund balance in excess of the targets, the American Rescue Plan funds, which we've gotten more detail on now, and the comprehensive fee schedule if we get to that point. So the first slide is really, we only had three CIP requests this year. One was for a facility maintenance building for our facility maintenance crew, which is currently outgrowing their facility space. They are proposing to build a new space at a cost of about $455,000. Fire alerting system, which is an upgrade or a replacement of the alerting systems that we have at our current fire stations. That's request is coming in at $495,000. And the relocation, and we've talked about this one, of fire station number 4, our estimate for that at this point is $5 million. Mike added and wanted to keep in the back of our head is the Public Works building, because it runs along the river and the river renewal project may interfere. That's something we have to keep in the back of our mind as far as going forward, whether we're going to need to do something with that facility. I believe that's what Mike's intent was.
Yeah, if I could jump in there just a little bit. To Public Works' credit, I think part of that is kind of a recognition that times are tight, don't even ask. But, if we're going to do proper planning, I want to keep those big ticket items in our minds. And not necessarily so much the river project as just the footprint of that facility is pretty tight. And as they grow and expand or try to offer additional services, we've talked a long time about it. It'd be nice to have a different location. So 10 million's a ballpark estimate. It's a big ticket item. Not saying that it's going to be in the future budget, other than, my experience in other communities is if you get into that habit of just not even having aspirations, you don't plan for them and you never solve it. We need to keep it at least in the conversation.
Is that a good location?
That current location, ideally, we would either keep that location and dedicate it to one particular division to give them more space and then relocate. But, if you look at the school's maintenance facility there on Broadway and the footprint of that and that type of facility, we could certainly justify something similar. In terms of location, the initial reaction is Central makes the most sense, but it's hard to get property. We work our sanitation operation out of there. We're having them at the landfill might make more sense to finish their day and empty their trucks. And so we haven't spent a lot of time talking about siting other than just that it's a future need.
In terms of the facility maintenance building, is that something that we've got a site selected and
Well, we've had some conversations there as well.
No? Okay.
Parks has a handful of properties that we've just kind of catch as catch can located them in. So we could take one of our existing facilities and try to upgrade it and improve the footprint. You may not, well, you may not be familiar with it as we refer to it, but there's the Gold Storage Building by Kenwood Cove. We have about 2/3 of that, but that's a very small space, doesn't allow for a lot of circulation. We have a property at Stimmel Road. Again, that's subject to flooding, but it's a property that we own. But I think we probably need to be a little open to all possibilities there.
Thank you.
Well, the Public Works Building, I know that's a little ways off, but are you looking, I mean, with that 10 million, are you looking at one large facility that sort of encompasses everything, or 4 buildings, or?
Right. That cost estimate would be kind of a campus approach. If we ended up dividing up the campus and the budget, not to say it couldn't be done a different way, but that's kind of where that number came from.
And then that lot across the street next to Bennett's stuff there, who owns that? Do we know? That's not the railroads or anything, is it? Or
No, I think Ben, if I'm thinking of the same one, I think Bennett's.
maybe all the empty area there too
Right.
then? Okay.
Yep.
I didn't-
Yep. So, and, the other thing that we'll get into later in the study session presentation is kind of a debt planning. If we're going to take on a project like that, my grand vision for our finances is that we have a debt levy that's pretty constant. We're not jumping all over the place. And then we have a long-term debt plan where debt rolls off pretty consistently, and we can take on projects, and we get a little bit more systematic and organized about tackling a project like this.
And that feeds into the second slide, or the second table here. This is something we presented in strategic planning. This is the bridge replacement. We had concern about critical infrastructure and how we're going to make sure that we're looking to the future for replacement of that. I just provided this as information so that as we go through, as Mike said, in the next couple of slides, we've done some different scenarios on our debt financing and how our capacity would be for our debt capacity. Jacob, if you want to flip to the next one, he's sleeping over there when he's supposed to be flipping my screen. So what we did, just a little bit of review. The timeline of financing for any project typically is that we get approval for that project from City Commission. It's typically in 2021, you might approve a project in 2022. And the year that that project begins, we typically temp note that because we don't have final costs and we don't have all that information. So as that project completes, that's usually a 1-year temp note. If it completes in the second year, then we would typically issue bonds on that completed project in the second year, and the debt payments wouldn't be due, the first payment would not come due until the third year. So it gives us some ability to say, okay, we can go ahead and do this project knowing that we're not going to have that debt payment until the third year of that project. So we did 2 scenarios here. This first one is if we left the mill levy flat at the current mill levy rate, which is 6.803, and we assumed that our assessed valuation was going to increase by 1% a year, how much would we have the capacity to debt finance each of those years? So if you look at, like, for example, 2023 project year, and that's the year that the project would begin, and we have a capacity of, and what I tried to do is build in here these big projects that we're talking about, the bridge replacements, the fire station, and some of those into the model to make sure that if, as we go forward planning, that we do have the capacity as well as, we kind of can then give us an idea of when to begin those things. So in this capacity, you can see most years we would have a little over 2 million, and some we'd have 3 million. We could certainly meet the requirements of the bridge plan and the fire station 1 replacement plan, and still maintain budget fund levels above our target at $800,000. There might be a year or 2 in there that we might go a little bit below, but not a huge amount below. But that establishes the future, that establishes a current mill levy rate that never changes, and all that funding goes into that fund. Some years we may have money in there. As you can see, sometimes our fund balance might grow to $2 million, but that's in anticipation of a big financing that we might be doing in a following or a couple years down the road. On the next slide, the scenario that we ran was if we said that our current taxes that we generate for the debt service fund are a little over $6 million, what does that do for our capacity? It's certainly a little bit lower than what we have with the other scenario because it takes into account some growth, But we still have the capability to finance those larger projects in the years that we are anticipating those would need to go to be financed. So those are just kind of two approaches that we could take. And that could be some direction that you give us as far as this is kind of where we want to be. Certainly from a taxpayer's perspective, a flat mill rate is a flat mill rate, and it's not going to change what I'm going to be paying every year. Whereas on the other side, for a flat tax, that's going to lower that mill rate in the future years because we assume we're going to have growth. So the revenue that we're going to collect off of that is going to create a lower mill rate for that. That either allows us to put that to the general fund, leave our mill rate the same, or lower in some cases, whatever commission would decide to do with that.
And Debbie and I have talked about this, but didn't really coordinate that it'd be part of this presentation, but that all starts to relate to that revenue neutral approach that the state has recently enacted, where we have to make a deliberate decision if we want to do anything other than remain revenue neutral. So the second scenario assumes that tax revenue stays flat, which would be considered revenue neutral. The first scenario would leave that mill rate the same, but if there's growth, would require ongoing public notice and process on the part of the governing body.
And you had mentioned Mike, you'd mentioned to me in a conversation that we'd gotten some valuations for 2022 are going to be relatively flat?
Yes.
Okay, so we're not seeing a lot of growth in the valuations?
No.
Yeah, those just came in the last week
week.
and very, very flat.
Yep,
Okay.
they're very flat.
Talking about property values?
Yes.
Yep. We kind of had the same reaction.
I know.
We're still trying to track down the rest of that story. I'm not saying there's anything incorrect about that, just trying
The
to,
market wouldn't say that.
well, recognizing that that is probably a legitimate question between now and when we talk revenue next week. Our intention is to try to get a little bit more of that backstory to get a better understanding.
Thank you.
I don't remember what that percent was, but was it 0.49%? Do you remember in those? I don't remember
It
off the
was
top of my head. I've
0.3%,
looked at
I believe, of growth.
a few numbers
Yep.
since then, so.
I mean, from a revenue standpoint, with that particular number, we estimated that if we left the mill rate the same, it'd be a revenue increase of like $89,000.
Yeah, not a lot.
Don't spend it all in one place.
Right.
And
So-
if we have to pay for a notice up that we're
Yes.
increasing, we'd have to pay for that, right?
Just the letters that go out, we'd have to share the cost if anyone else was doing that. That cost would be split between whatever taxing entities were actually increasing their rate, higher than the revenue neutral rate, correct. Are there any questions about those two debt scenarios before I move on to kind of some of the other information? Okay, so some of the other backside information that we've talked about before, but just reiterating the information so that we can remember where we've been. During strategic planning, we had set aside some organizational priorities and brought those forward. Some of those included deferred expenses, agenda management software, updating the city website, a time and attendance system, a temporary grant coordinator position, a vehicle and equipment replacement plan and schedule, facilities audit, Fire Station 4 was on that priority list, and then critical infrastructure, which we considered was bridges. Other operational considerations that we've been trying to think through as we go through this process is our economic development fund balance. We know we're using a majority of that in the current economic development project that we're supporting. Again, vehicles and equipment, the Parks Master Plan, debt service reserve, if there's any necessary there, the fire alerting system, the building maintenance facility, and the Public Works building are all other operational considerations. And then we always have those outside, I wouldn't call it outside, but projects and initiatives that are out in the community that we're still keeping our eye on and wanting to do something with. The River Renewal Project, the Baseball Enterprises Project, the tennis project, housing infill, housing infrastructure, and then the hotel grants that have been brought forward in recent days.
And I should probably jump in on hotels. That's not something that staff's brought to you yet. Chamber of Commerce just kind of made an initial inquiry early on when we'd yet to know the American Rescue Plan numbers, but had offered up the possibility of a financial assistance for hotels, and I think they had a per dollar amount per room and estimated citywide about $3.5 million. And so haven't really, I kind of put that off knowing we need to get through the ARPA conversation and need to get through this conversation. If that's something we want to pursue, we can gather additional details and build a kind of a grant structure, whether it's for hotels or other requests.
Nope.
And you'll see kind of where that fits in as we start to talk about the American Rescue Fund. So then the questions have become, so what possible available funds are there? So what we focused on really were the funds that we have capacity in and have the ability to spend anything that's above what our target is currently set at. So that leads us with, in the general fund, about $4.2 million. In the sales tax capital fund, about $4.9 million. In special parks, about $415,000. Special gas, $1.1 million. And in the American Rescue Plan funds, the number that we were given that was set last week was $7,061,942.49. So we finally kind of have a number that we can work towards from the American Rescue Plan funding. And speaking of that, we also wanted to bring forward some information about the background, because we keep getting questions about, can we spend it on that? Can we spend it on that? So we wanted to really give you that information, as much information as we had available, so that as we kind of look at these decisions and you kind of make decisions, you can kind of figure out where those numbers would fall in this, the eligibility of these funds. So as we know, the American Rescue Plan allocates amounts for cities less than $50,000 based on population. The money does go through the state, so the state's going to receive the money, and then they allocate it to the city. The numbers were posted last week, giving the city of Saline an expected revenue of a little over $7 million. We'll receive payments in two different tranches. The first one will be sometime during the first 2 weeks of July of 2021, and the remaining funds will be received in July of 2022. Something to remember that we have to keep our eye on as we kind of plan some of these longer-term projects is we must obligate or have a contractual commitment for those funds by December 31st of 2024, and we actually have to have spent the funds by December 31st of 2026. So if we come in with a project that begins in 2025, we have to make sure that project is completed by 2026 in order to use those funds for that project, if we're using this as an eligible reason for that funding. The ineligible uses of the funds is to offset a reduction in net tax. So we can't say we're going to lower our taxes and use this money to make up that funding. It's pretty straightforward, and it cannot be deposited into a pension fund. So those were pretty easy for us. A couple of the, keep flipping the wrong pages. Did I skip one again?
Yeah, eligible uses.
See, I do that. Skip page 10. Eligible uses. There's 4 major categories of eligible uses. The first one is to actually respond to the public health emergency and its negative economic impacts. B is for workers performing essential work, which is basically what they're calling a premium pay. C is for the provision of services to the extent of the reduction in revenue that a local government had due to the COVID health emergency. And D is to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. So as we look at the $7 million, we have to be able to justify its use under one of these 4 categories. I will caveat that by saying under category C, once we say we've lost that revenue and we're reimbursing ourselves for that revenue, then that funding can be used for whatever the city chooses to use it for. There's no more, we have to have that eligibility requirement because we've met that eligibility under item C.
And on item D, does that include other infrastructure like bridges, roads, anything like that?
No, it's very specific to water, sewer, or broadband. Yes, yeah. So now we can skip slide 11 because we already went over that one. So looking at eligible use, so in our minds, we wanted to look at eligible use number C, which would give us a lot of flexibility in how we actually use that, and then to see if we could qualify for any of those projects that we might want to use under eligible use D. So under C, and this one gets a little complicated, basically what it says is that 2019 is our base year, whatever we collected in specific revenue, and they call it general revenue of the government, and that is defined in the census, in a Census Bureau online, we do a kind of a census for the Census Bureau, and they define what that general revenue is. So they take out certain things out of our revenue. For example, they don't include any utility revenue, or if we had liquor stores, we couldn't include revenue for liquor, if we owned a liquor store, or insurance trust revenues for like pensions and things like that. But for the calculation of the revenue reduction, it says that we can take our three-year average growth from 17, 18, and 19, and we can calculate that growth, and that's what we would have expected to get in 2020. And then we compare that to 2019 to see what that difference is. And so as we look through these slides, and this next slide kind of gives you what that general revenue looks like. And like I said, it's not utility revenue, it's not liquor store revenue, which leaves us with the majority of the revenue we have. So what we did as a staff to calculate this is we took every revenue line item for the city in our budgeted funds, that's our general revenue, and we selected those ones that we felt were not eligible, so we took those out of the calculation. So we took out the utilities, and we took out the bonds and things like that that weren't eligible. And then we came up with a total general revenue. On slide 14, we show that as in 2019 as $60,775,687. And what we need to remember is that these revenue increases over these 3 years include many things. So that it includes the sales tax increase in 2017. It includes tax increases that we've done in property tax or fee increases, any of those things. So from that information, we calculated that our 3-year average was 6.07% growth over that 3-year 2017 to 2019 period. And assuming a 7.6 or 6.07% growth, we would have expected our 2020 revenue to be $64,462,340. We compared that to our actual revenue of a little over 59 million, which left us with a lost revenue of a little over $5 million. As part of the guidelines for the reduction in revenue calculation, the government set a minimum amount that you could use as that calculation. So their minimum amount that we would be able to use for that is 4.1%. So if our rate didn't come in at over 4.1%, we could have still used 4.1%. They based that, I think, on inflation or something like that. They tried to make it simple, but they didn't always do that. But even if we used that minimum growth and didn't do any calculations, our lost revenue would still be about a little over $3.8 million just for 2020. Now, we're allowed to carry that calculation forward in 2021, 2022, and 2023 because we have until 2024 to use these funds. Obviously, we don't have that information yet, so we know what the rate should be. The 6.7% is not going to change. The base year is not going to change, 2019. So as we continue to get the revenue numbers in, we could certainly calculate what that lost revenue amount was and qualify that funding for those lost revenue years. So what I did on that bottom calculation was I took, if our revenue comes in at what we budgeted in 2021, what would that lost revenue look like? And in 2021, the budgeted revenue was about almost $61 million, and we compared that to our base year of $60 million, or our expected revenue of $68 million, and that leaves us a lost revenue of about $7 million. So I think the story is that we will eventually have probably enough lost revenue to cover that entire $7 million. We may not have it this year because we don't know those numbers, but by the middle of next year, when we get the second tranche, which we won't get till the middle of next year, we would certainly have those numbers.
So we can basically fall under eligible use C for the total amount of funds we'll receive.
According to our calculations, yes. And that's even if I believe, even if we use their minimum number of 4.10, and we don't even argue what all of those revenue codes are and anything like that, we could probably still qualify.
And we're talking about 2 years when there's additional out years beyond
Right.
that.
Right.
So
Right.
So.
I think there's plenty of likelihood that we'd meet that number just on the lost revenue calculation alone.
Unless revenues just rebound very quickly, which we're not necessarily seeing at this point.
Right, and so if we do qualify under that basis, under C, we can really use that funding any way we want. So, I mean, that's the main point there is it really frees it up to be used on basically anything.
So there are some other qualifiers to this. You have to use it within the period of the grant process, and as I mentioned earlier, that begins on March 3rd, 2021, and ends on December 31st, 2024. And we're not seeing that that's going to be a problem. The infrastructure eligibility use basically says that we can invest it in necessary improvements to our water and sewer infrastructure. And the way they simplified this, because people are going, well, what does that mean? So the way they, in their minds, simplified this was to say that anything that would qualify for an Environmental Protection Agency Clean Water State Revolving Loan or Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund bond or issue would qualify for this particular eligible use. So any of our projects that we're using state revolving loan funds for would qualify for this use as far as the infrastructure was concerned.
And just as a clarification, as we're referring to infrastructure as part of this conversation, that's relative to the American Rescue Plan Act funding that is forthcoming. The conversation that's happening nationally about another round of stimulus funding for infrastructure may have a different set of rules. Hopefully, it would be broader. The conversations included roads and other forms of infrastructure. So don't know what to tell you in terms of timing, likelihood, dollar amount of any of that, but if you're following that conversation, that's another possible source of funding.
Correct. So then on slide 17, where I'm just taking, this is straight from what we provided last week. And these were the summary of kind of the proposed usages that staff came up with for your consideration in our budget initiatives. One was to transfer funds that hadn't been spent out of the sales tax fund into a parks maintenance fund, into a vehicle and equipment replacement fund, or to create a vehicle and equipment replacement fund, and to create a fleet management fund and transfer some of the unspent funding from vehicles and equipment into that fund. We did propose that we use the special gas tax fund for the EDA grant match. And then as we recognize net gains in the sales tax fund, that we increase the funding for Kenwood Cove. And then we also commit to some to spend some of the unspent funds in the streets, hike, bike, and buildings and facilities, especially if we see growth that allows us to do that. So then we wanted to take a look, and I'll kind of start talking here in a minute. We'll kind of start having some conversations, because that was a lot of background information on kind of where we can spend it, where it is, and what our kind of initiatives have been. In the sales tax capital fund, we have available excess of target fund balance about $4.9 million. As our initiatives indicated, we would take $970,000 of that, put it in the park maintenance fund, of which $600,000 was already kind of committed to the tennis project. We would take $1 million and put it in a fleet management fund. We would allow the spending of the streets deferred expenditures of $1.1 million, and we would allow the spending of deferred expenditures in the buildings and facilities of $600,000. That would leave us about $1.2 million of fund balance over our target. And if we look a little bit forward and we say, okay, what's that going to do to 2021? Because we're talking about 2020 numbers here. So we still have some effect of what's happening in 2021. When we budgeted 2021, we budgeted a net income in the sales tax revenue capital fund of about $750,000. And that was based on revenue projections from 2019. However, we're seeing those projections go up. We saw 2020 be a little bit higher than 2019. So I made an adjustment for that to make sure that to get to a 2020 actual for 2021. We take out the target fund balance, and that leaves us with about $2.9 million in that fund, beyond what we've already said these initiatives are. So as we know, that sales tax capital fund has a lot of commitments to it, and this is the spreadsheet that is kind of, we all dread to see, but it has so much information on it. It kind of tells the whole story of the sales tax capital fund. And this particular graph assumes that we hit 2020 revenues in 2021, and that we have a 0.5% growth thereafter. It's accounted for all of the initiatives that I just mentioned. And as you can see, at the end of 2039, which is our last debt commitment, we still have about $1 million left in that fund. That takes into account the commitments that we've already said we have for the river project, for the $12 million of construction there, the $1.5 million of final design, and the water rights. So as that fund is getting stronger, that kind of sets a standard of kind of where we think we might be. But as we've been seeing on the next page, we've been budgeting very conservatively at a 0.5% because the sales tax numbers are pretty fluid. But if you look at the next graphic, in 2018, we had a growth of 1.63%, 2019, 1.98%, 2020, we had a 0.5%, which is pretty good for COVID. And that averages at 1.3% growth over the last 3 years. So if we took into consideration anything above 0.5, which is what we've been budgeting all along, we can see in that graphic on the right, if we assume that that growth was 0.75%, then the blue is what is our excess in that fund annually. So you can see we'll grow up to about $300,000 annually in excess funding in that, just by having that growth change to 0.75. If that growth is actually closer to that 1%, we're looking at additional funding of about $700,000 by the time we get to 2036. So it's just exponentially growing. So the story I think that I want you to know is that I'm very comfortable with where we're at in that fund and what commitments we've made in that fund with taking the initiatives that we've had, that we've recommended in doing with this excess funding. And also, we should have the ability to utilize that excess growth for Kenwood Cove maintenance. We may be able to use that for transfers to the general fund for salary increases and so that kind of that property tax stabilization. So there's a lot of things that we could do with that increased funding as we see that growth happen. Now, obviously, we may not want to budget, and we may, but we may. You may be comfortable saying, okay, let's budget to 1%, because that's what we've seen, and we can certainly do that. But we have some opportunity to look at how can we not necessarily commit to it, but kind of set it aside to use for things that we think are important later.
So if I could jump in for just a little bit, Debbie did a good job of covering that. It feels like we're maybe see some light at the end of the tunnel for a change. You know, I'm sure you recall the Citizens. Why am I drawing a blank on the newsletter? But the Salina Citizen publication that kind of committed to the different initiatives that be funded by the sales tax. We've struggled for quite a while to kind of confirm that the revenue was there. Then on top of that, we had a few projects that we debt financed beyond the life of that sales tax, which was a point of concern. And then, as we talked about the river project and the availability of funds and some of those others, we've just spent a lot of time trying to confirm that everything was going to be there. Then you have COVID on top of that. So we've spent a lot of time kind of trying to sort through those challenges. This approach, that $1 million balance that Debbie mentioned, it resolves the debt financing beyond the term of the sales tax. It would leave us with a balance that could be drawn upon. This meets the commitments that we've identified as part of the Salina Citizen, and that percentage allocation. The conversation was focused on establishing some fund balances, but I want to reassure those in the room and listeners at home that this isn't by shifting it away from a prior commitment. This is trying to just model what we have going forward. And then, it may be a little too soon to promise that it can solve our salary problem, but at least starts to look like we might be able to free up some revenue if we continue to see some growth that we've not had available for us in the past to address pay plan challenges.
I did have one question in regard to the river project. In the last few years, it seems like we've gone from a $15 million projected commitment down to 12. And later in the presentation, I noticed that you had some, I think it was $500,000 going back into the river. And in terms of some of this funding, I mean, I know that we're doing our best to value engineer things, but I think we'd all agree that at a certain point of value engineering, we're not getting the product that we want and that we've pitched in this line of citizens. So I guess my question is, would there be, what do we need to do to be able to fulfill the promise that we made in this line of citizen? I mean, do we need to restore the full $3 million? Is that something where, I mean, I've heard that there have been some pretty difficult conversations about, what's absolutely necessary at this point, and I didn't know if that might be a possibility to restore some of that funding.
Sure, good question, and I want to give Debbie and Martha free rein to correct me if I get off track here, but there's been conversation about what the funding level, the original funding commitment was, and where it stands. So you may recall, as part of a past budget conversation, we walked through that Salina Citizen funding commitment, how that math played out in terms of debt financing. I think part of the issue was the commitment was that we would transfer our payments for the Kenwood Cove debt to the river project. I think part of that confusion was a lack of recognition that we had some years of Kenwood Cove debt after 2016 that had to be paid first. So we went back and confirmed what, if we did everything the Salina Citizen said, what that dollar amount would be, and we're still modeling to that dollar amount. So I understand the confusion, but I don't want to leave on the table that funding's been taken away from the river project. I think there's been a clarification of what that number was. Now, having said that, we are struggling with value engineering. We're continuing to have conversations with HDR, our designers, and the Corps of Engineers. Part of that, if you set aside COVID, if you set aside the cost increases associated with materials, I think part of that is as you get a higher level of detail about scope and flood elevations and the mechanics of some of the bridge hydraulics, those type of things, though they're kind of typical budget challenges you're going to face with a project. Then you add on top of that the cost increases associated with COVID. And so we have a meeting yet this week where it's the next round of HDR trying to walk us through their design options and their cost estimates, as well as our options with the Corps of Engineers. We remain mindful that what was that vision that was communicated in the Salina Citizen. I'm not prepared to say that we've had to concede anything as part of that vision just yet, but the numbers continue to be difficult. And just being completely honest, I don't have a sense, and I'm not sure our designers have a sense of material cost, construction cost. We've got to get through scope, initial budget estimate, Corps of Engineers funding, final design, then take it to bid. So I'm not even sure timing-wise how that might sync up with kind of the material challenges that are going on today. But that's a long way of saying I'm not at all prepared to say that there aren't value engineering challenges. But I'm also, Debbie and Martha, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but we've at least gone back and verified the funding's there as initially described for the project. It's now a case of, can we get the scope we had in mind for the funds that we have available?
And I think what might be a little bit confusing from this particular spreadsheet is that it shows that there's $12 million committed to construction, but what it doesn't show is that there was $5 million already either spent or committed to design, and another almost million for water rights. So we're almost to $18 million in this plan, in this projection.
Gotcha.
Which is well within what we had originally, like Mike said, promised as far as the comparison of debt to from Kenwood Cove to the river project.
Gotcha, thank you.
Now, having said that, we are heavily dependent on our design consultants for what kind of scope of a project can we get for that budget, and those are the hard conversations we're having with them right now.
Thank you.
So this may be a good stopping point to see if you have questions or get your sense of whether we have consensus about setting aside the sales tax capital funds in unbudgeted reserve accounts as described. The intention there is really to make sure that deferred expenditures, those funds are being set aside for their original intended purposes and that we've segregated those balances. As you can see in that one table, 3 out of the 4 categories are deferred expenditures. The fourth category is fleet management. While that may not be a deferred expenditure, we're trying to make the transition to the enterprise fleet model, and this is a way for us to take that annual allocation, set it aside, and we have fluctuations in the performance of the enterprise fleet model. We've got some reserve to draw on.
Would then most of the vehicles covered in the fleet leasing agreement would not be included in this list? Or
The fleet model, well, currently, we have, all of our vehicle and equipment is kind of together. We have large equipment, we have things that are beyond what enterprise can do. So we're funding the enterprise fleet vehicles as well as others. In this model, we'd set aside this balance, we'd continue the annual commitment of, that dollar allocation. And so if on the fleet side, there's a cost, we could draw on this balance, which should then free up the annual allocation for non-fleet items. But we would continue that annual commitment towards vehicles and equipment.
So at this point, I was just trying to jot down some notes. You would like some guidance in terms of the debt scenarios that were presented on pages 3 and 4, and then the sales tax revenue projections? Is that?
Yeah, more
is that
so the
is that-
sales tax revenue. The debt will be coming back to you project by project, but trying to give you a sense of the model we're trying to develop and manage to.
And I will add that fleet management, it is in a way a deferred because we've used what we had, as we had recognized as the unspent funding for vehicles and equipment through 2020 was about a little over $1 million. So we're kind of utilizing that to set up that fund. So we're not taking what wouldn't have been, what wasn't deferred in the first place, if that makes sense.
I mean, if you're looking for input now, I mean, I think I would probably, in terms of our sales tax projections, I guess I would still prefer to go more conservative. I mean, maybe go up to the 0.75 growth, but I would just hate for what I ideally with the big projects that we've got listed, I'd rather budget that conservatively, and then if we have excess, maybe it'll give us some flexibility in terms of starting a new project early, or if we have something come up, in terms of fire station number 4, or the river, or the, facilities, buildings that we're talking about, we would have some flexibility to react to that. That's just my opinion, and I don't know.
So you're saying you're at the 0.75?
Yeah, I'm saying either
Calculation,
0.5 or
not the 0.5.
0.75 projected growth.
I'm comfortable with the 0.75.
Yeah.
Quick question, on page 19, are those the numbers that we've been looking at all along? Because I was trying to remember if on the far right column, if that's always shown as a positive. So this is, or is this an updated?
It is updated
Okay.
through the end of 2020
Okay.
with its actuals and with the budgeted numbers for 2021.
Okay,
Back to the, so I adjusted it for that 2020 additional revenue we expect to come in. We also took out all of these initiatives.
okay.
So,
Because this looks better than what it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
that's, okay.
Yeah.
I was going,
yeah.
don't remember.
Well, our beginning fund balance was about 1.2 million when we, on the older version, so,
Right, so, okay. I didn't, wanted to verify that that was correct.
yes.
I made a note, but I can't find it. The deferred expenditures for streets are which projects, what type projects?
I'm sorry, which what?
The deferred expenditures under streets under sales tax capital fund?
Right,
The third one,
right.
or fourth line. What type projects were those again?
Typically, sales tax pays for mill and inlay. It pays for some of the normal crack seal, and they have a whole section of category that's spent out of sales tax under the sub-CIP. So those would be those projects that either
The projects
deferred
that
or,
we had scheduled for last year, which,
and we probably paid them out of
were-
gas tax, some of them.
and a lot of them were just not done last year because we didn't.
Right, yeah,
Wanna get
we went into
to lose
COVID, we
spending money,
pulled
right?
that back. I don't know that we can tell you location by location as much as we just didn't
but
fund the
just the-
2020 annual street program for staff
all
to
these were
schedule and bring back.
Things that would have been done last year, which we
Right.
decided.
Yeah,
for good
I
reasons
don't think
not
that
to.
We either
1.1
didn't
includes,
spend them, or we spent them out of gas tax.
is that 1.1 all 2020 money? I think that, some of
No.
that money goes back, so maybe we had a program that wasn't as much 2 years ago, so we've added that money into that 1.1 million.
That's over the
So
last
it's-
4 years.
Yeah, it's not all just 2020 money.
Correct.
So that represents deferrals from the last 4 years then?
Or under budget,
Hypothetically,
or,
okay.
you
budget
know,
was $1 million and we spent 900,000, so we
Right.
left
Oh,
100,000 on
right.
the table.
Right.
I mean, we did the projects that we had planned to do, maybe they came in cheaper than what we thought they would, and
Right.
rather than
Okay.
redirecting it, we just held it back.
correct.
Makes sense.
Thank you.
That's correct.
Would this, how close would this get us to completing all of our deferred projects? Just for streets? Are there any more street projects that were deferred other than what this?
No, I think we've
What-
scheduled everything that was deferred. It would just allow us to keep with our regular maintenance program as we move forward.
Right, so this
More
would,
expensive.
this would catch us up to where we should be?
Should,
Well, this would set up a fund, which would then be dedicated to street work. So over time, the Public Works Department could spend that balance down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're prepared to, with $1.1 million worth of projects above and beyond the annual budget yet this calendar year. I mean, what we're saying is.
I mean, each year has new projects, but
Right.
how much do we have in arrearage that we've?
But from a budget standpoint, it's that 1.1. We didn't max out the budget every year. I don't know that we can tell you this street was scheduled for 2019 and didn't happen. It's more a case of the full annual allocation wasn't spent. If we set this aside as a dedicated reserve balance, then the Public Works Department knows as they plan budgets going forward, they have their annual allocation as well as this balance. If it's not dedicated, we end up having this more nebulous conversation about, do you want to spend it on streets? Do you want to spend it on building maintenance? Do you want to spend it on parks? By doing this, we're saying we're going to dedicate it for these allocated purposes, and then staff can manage our budgeting going forward on that basis.
And I guess where I'm trying to get more to parks. And I'm just trying to figure out how much of this
Right.
streets need. Can any of this be, get streets, parks needs more? Which one has the bigger need right now?
Boy, that's a good question. What we do know
your question is, can we take part of that 1.1 million and put it to parks? That's a question.
Yeah, and we certainly can. I mean, we have the
Sure.
ability to do that. That 1.1 is based on what we said we were going to spend on streets over time, that dollar amount. I don't even remember what it is off the top of my head. That's what we had allocated. So that's the money annually that we didn't spend. So we could shift it to parks. We could shift it to anything. I mean, we don't have to spend any of this as it's allocated on the slide. So we, if you wanted to take it away from streets and spend it on parks, we could certainly do that.
And if it's helpful, the one thing I would tell you is, we've budgeted conservatively. Our actual performance has been fairly conservative, and we have struggled for years to meet those original obligations that were promised. And so we're kind of transitioning from a conversation about reprioritizing to, in the next couple of years, we're hopeful that we can meet our baseline commitments and then have some additional funds so that you have some discretion going forward.
That's actually kind of where I was going, and when you look at what folks in town say is high priority, it's our parks. I mean, not the streets aren't,
Right.
but if this is an opportunity to start shifting our budget money towards our priorities, I'm just
Yeah.
trying to steer a little more towards
We've got
parks.
$500,000 a year as an annual allocation for parks. There's the 970 in the deferred expenditures that's identified. This funds or the tennis project, this funds, and we'll get into the details of the baseball project, but it funds the baseball project. And so at that point, there's 600,000 towards tennis, 870,000 towards parks, and 4 million towards baseball.
Because all I can see is that real long list of things in parks that's still,
Sure.
well, I was going to call it undone and unfunded, but I think that's probably correct.
Right, because, and that was
Yeah.
what, 5.9 million
Yeah.
in,
Close to 6 million.
yes, close to 6 million, and at $500,000 a year, I just don't see us ever making much progress.
And in all honesty, I'm not sure about the accuracy of that 6 million number. I mean, everything I just described, it'd be 1.5, 5.5. Just with the funds as we've described them, there's 5.5 million, and that's just some parks maintenance, tennis, and baseball. So no, I guess all I know to tell you is the prior commitment was $500,000 a year towards parks. We're trying to honor that commitment as well as then tackle the initiatives that have been brought to us. And I think,
Which one of these weeks do I try to get that 500,000 up to $1 million?
Well, this would not
this
allow
one-
you to
this
do
one happened
that
a week.
But this
annually,
is
because you have to take it
excess. I
from-
mean, this is the fund balance, so if you wanted to
Right.
do a one-time thing,
That's true, yeah.
we could certainly do that. We are still scheduled to spend the regular $3.2 million on streets next year that we have allocated into the future. So this is one-time kind of money that could be shifted. I mean, that's a possibility.
Or at least, knock off one of our big ticket items on parks. Like,
Jerry Ivy,
well, Jerry Ivy or Indian Rock.
Indian Rock.
Right, or I just look at all of those smaller deferred maintenance expenses that you could literally knock a lot of those, so many items off that list and really improve the functionality and the aesthetics and just, the general upkeep of parks that are so heavily used. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can go with that, but I really like the idea of shifting that 1.1 to parks to try to at least make some inroads on that deferred.
and we're kind of revisiting the strategic planning discussion. I mean, it's within your discretion, within the limits of the ballot language that authorized the sales tax, and within the guidance, if you want to call it that, that was the marketing language in the Salina Citizen. And, as part of that strategic planning conversation, we also had a conversation about the street maintenance cycle and the assumptions going into that. So it's certainly discretionary on your part as the governing body.
How did it address parks? I don't have that in front of me, the newsletter that talked about how we were funded out of this sales tax fund. What did it show?
Just a $500,000
Yeah.
increase, I think.
Give me
I don't know
a
if it had a
second.
specific dollar amount.
It just said, I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember.
I left, that's my other
I usually have that
briefcase.
with me, but.
I just see that list on parks, one of those things that's going to keep, it'll always keep growing because you always have ongoing maintenance. But at 500,000 a year,
It's going to take you 12 years, and then what you
Yeah,
do
but
the first year is
but-
going to need to be redone.
But we haven't
Yeah.
been spending the 500,000. I mean,
No,
we have how much sitting in that balance?
it has 970,000.
I
But-
thought I had more,
A
yeah.
lot of that's already allocated.
Some of it is, but I'm saying, on an annual basis, we're not even spending the 500,000, are we?
We
Yeah.
haven't been because we were going through the Parks Master Plan and trying to get that prioritized.
Okay.
So the direction to Park staff has been, let's wait till we get that all in order,
Right.
and then,
Okay.
once we get that in order, we can go, basically. So it's not at any, because we didn't want to, it's just, we were trying to get that order and that priority set.
Yeah, do it thoughtfully. Yeah.
Right,
Right.
right.
Well, I guess I'm okay with a one-time $500,000 shift. I really do think we need to do something in addition to what we've been doing to tackle that parks
You know, and
list.
the problem is, we have some large dollar items such as the restrooms and stuff, you
Yeah.
know, at the parks, and
Is that going to
that'll blow through your 500,000 and
But,
pretty
I mean,
quickly.
that's all right.
Yeah.
I mean,
But I mean, that's what we maybe need to look at.
wherever we spend it, I mean, if we have an opportunity to take care of one of those big items, you know, which would not be a recurring expense, obviously. I'd hope it'd be 30 years before we have to do them again, but, right, because, you know, they are in need of repair
Restrooms in all the parks.
in all the parks.
Yeah. So do we have consensus
didn't
on
help
doing
you,
that, I
did we?
guess?
So, yeah, and at what amount?
When I first started looking at this, I kind of wanted to get down the road and see where we were in the next budget cycle, but I'm amenable to a one-time shift, as Dr. Davis, you and the mayor are suggesting. I don't know that I want to go the whole million, but $1.1 million, but half of that.
Half is good.
I could live with that.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
In answer to your Salina citizen question, there's a lot of discussion in it about the river project and specific dollar amounts. As it relates to parks, it's more of a pie chart of percentage allocation
Okay.
of the available funds. So I think we backed into that 500,000 number
I
based.
could not remember.
Percentage.
Thanks.
So, I'm sorry I was multitasking, but the dollar amount to redirect was,
550,000, wouldn't that be half?
okay,
Your math's
my-
better than
with
mine.
my
I was
calculator.
going up to 650, but yeah, I think you're right.
okay. So, with that revision, is the rest of that proposed allocation acceptable?
It is for me.
Okay.
Where are we now? Page
And did-
21?
Yep.
Did I hear, or do we want to discuss the revenue projections? I thought I heard you kind of talking about the .75 as our growth projection when we do our budgeting?
Yeah, I
Or
thought that
do
was
we want to stay as
conservative and
conservative as .5?
acceptable.
Because that'll certainly help us for our discussion next week.
We get a couple.
I talked to
We made,
Mr. Scragg about this the other day, coming out of COVID. I'm not sure how we do that, because, I mean, I look at the car lots. Of course, this is for 2022, 2021, we're low, so some big ticket items, we're not going to see that sales tax. We could see that recovery in 2022 because, you know, the chips come in and chips may fall where they may. That's kind of a little joke there. So anyway, I would say .75 at the most. I mean, I have no troubles with .50, and then hopefully having something above that. It's always easier to say we have more funds than what we had budgeted than less, so.
Having a fund balance helps absorb if we, overestimate, if it's not too much. We've not had that luxury for a long, long time. But that's one thing in the back of my mind is if we say .75 and it comes in at .6, we do have some fund
Just from planning, for the jobs that we anticipate coming, do you really see any benefit from our budget for that before '23? I mean, the new economic growth,
I think they start up in 2022, well, I don't know. Kubota doesn't.
Would
We
be
are
enough.
seeing some
start.
pretty good growth right now, and we're attributing it to construction. People are in town for construction, and the retail numbers are just really,
That's where I struggle a bit,
significant.
is
So it's-
splitting out construction and stimulus. And figuring
Yeah.
out, if we didn't have COVID and stimulus, we kind of went into this expecting that construction jobs would see.
And that's where I was at also talking to Mr. Scragg, is that we had that stimulus money, and a lot of that hit the first portion of 2021 here that we're not going to see again probably. And that was at, what, $1,200 per person for those that qualified. So you saw a lot of families getting $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 to spend that they're not going to have in 2022.
right.
So
So would you feel more comfortable with staying at the .5?
Point.
I mean,
think
at least I kind of would for another year, just because we've had so many abnormalities with COVID and stimulus and things that I think it would be beneficial.
And we don't necessarily have to lock in. Part of what we'll do next week is walk you through the sales tax performance. I mean, Debbie provided you a historical average on the sales tax fund side, but we can, there'll be some.
And I know we're starting to see some of those funds from sales that are done on the internet, but that's just not a large number yet, though, right?
Correct. The
It's a-
dollar amount's not very
Yeah.
large. And I will say that projection, while we have this fund to kind of absorb whatever projections, we also have the general fund that we depend on sales tax to make a projection. So I think we want to be consistent whichever way we go, to make sure that we're consistent in both funding sources. So .5 for
Point
now.
five.
Fine.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay. So the next information that we'll talk about is transient guest tax. And this is information we provided before, the indication that the scenarios that we've projected here are to set the transient guest tax at 7.75%. What we had provided before were averages over the last 3 years through 2019. I also added in here scenarios if we included 2020, which was very low, and if we only did 2020. So we're thinking 2020 is a worst-case scenario. It's got to get better. I did do a little research in the American Hotel and Lodging Association's hotel industry report, and they're reporting that while we're seeing some increases, they don't expect to get full recovery until 2024. The numbers that we see on the next slide on 22, these are our actual collections. Our last distribution was April, but that was collections through February of 2021. So we were still in COVID then. We hadn't released a lot of mask mandates. It was prior to spring break. So I think we're seeing a little bit better than what we did the worst case last year, but we're still below. April last year was before COVID, so it really wasn't a good comparative. When we get our July numbers, I think that'll be a little bit better to tell us kind of what that growth is starting to look like for 2021. So this one's a little bit of again, we don't know really where it'll fall, but back on slide 21, we talked about for baseball that we thought that transient guest tax would support about $2.5 million of debt over 10 years, depending on how quickly that transient guest tax rebounds and how quickly we actually fund that project. As you recall, when we fund, it's like 2 or 3 years down the road before we actually have debt service payments. And another obstacle we have to look at besides the collection is that if we want to fund this with debt, with general obligation bonds, we do have a charter ordinance that limits our bonding ability to $1 million a year for public park improvements. That can be changed. We can always go back and change that. We have options to debt finance internally. So we do have some options to get this project going, but ultimately it's a policy decision as to whether you're comfortable with committing that portion to $2.5 million of financing for that project. And I don't know if you want to address that specifically now, or wait until we get to the next section
Yeah,
that we're
if you've
proposing.
read ahead, you see that there's also a $1.5 million placeholder for baseball. So you put these two together and that hits the $4 million target number. But I think the question, the discussion point at the moment is just, you can see there that in 2019, we were at about $296,000 of revenue, and to finance 2.5 million over a 10-year term at 3%, that's about the same. It's almost a 1-for-1 there. So if we can get back to 2019 numbers, that supports the 2.5. If we can get lower interest rates, that helps a little bit. So I think we're, in the right range. It's really a question of the COVID recovery and its impacts.
Yeah, when it comes to baseball, softball, and I don't know if we put this back on the agenda here in the next few weeks, but because of being a year and a half out from when we initially addressed this, I'm not sure if 4 million is still that number. I have personally a thought process that we really need to address Bill Burke fairly quickly, not only because of the facility conditions, the restrooms, that type of thing. And I got to thinking, I don't know if we want to take this in two different chunks, and one of them being Bill Burke, and then if we do look to do the Premier Diamond at East Crawford, that's something different, because the East Crawford, the Baseball Enterprises took those funds and moved those fields to South High. So, and I'm concerned about the timing. We can't be doing construction at Bill Burke during the summer, because that's when those fields are being used. So I'm not sure, even if we started addressing baseball, softball at Bill Burke next week, do we still get those fields playable for next spring? And so if we don't look at that fairly quickly, we're out another year to having those facilities up and running.
So if there's some issues with scope, we can deal with that if we get the money teed up now.
Yeah.
Yes, if we can, I know it's been through a lot of twists and turns over the years in terms of how we first financed it, then COVID, and then we thought we had transient guest tax, then COVID hit, then understandably, you as a governing body had concerns about the term of the lending, and then we backed off the transient guest tax rate a little bit, and so it's been quite a moving target. But in answer to your question, if we can reach some general consensus that, yes, we've got to get through the protest period for the transient guest tax, but we're going forward on the transient guest tax, and amongst all the other competing priorities for funding, we're committed to X number of dollars for baseball on top of the transient guest tax, then yes, we can start prioritizing projects and start working the scope. And that's part of the strategic
The
plan.
commission will find a consensus about that, and then that's going to free staff to work on the scope issues with different.
Yeah, and I think there's some dollars out there you could put towards this, and I could see us trying not to fund 2.5 million. That may be I don't know what the scope is. It's been so long at Bill Burke.
Yeah.
That may be a $1.5 to $2 million scope. Let's say it's a $2 million. We may come up with other dollars that we only need to debt service $1 million or $1.5 million. That would be my preference.
So what I'm hearing is we need to review the scope, because it has been so long. And I guess my other question is Baseball Enterprises fundraising, is that complete, or are there still some funds to come in from them, in light of the fact that the softball fields were done at Salina South? I mean, where do we stand on that?
I can't speak for Baseball Enterprises.
Right,
And my focus has been trying to get to a decision point on finances, recognizing that we then have to pick the conversation back up with Baseball Enterprises.
Yeah, I'm just going to give you my opinion from conversations I've had, and I think Bill Burke is kind of ours to do.
Sure.
And I think we kind of felt a little bit that way when we initially started, so.
And, if some of that part money goes towards the restrooms, that's less money that has to be taken from another source to, because that has to be part of that Bill Burke project.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes,
It
please.
Yeah.
I mean,
So I think this is helpful. If, as a next discussion point, we get direction on that 1.5 number or whatever that turns out to be to baseball, well, that certainly is a starting point, and we can know that we might have to adjust the amount to be financed by way of transient guest tax, but we're in the $3.5–4 million range. That gives us some latitude as staff to get started working on scope and costing the project and costing out the project, and then we can come back and say, here's what we comfortably think we can get. And, we've talked about, in strategic planning, we've talked about the bathrooms, we've talked about trying to solve drainage and rain-out issues and turf infields, and there's some, those type of improvements will make a noticeable improvement on the facility.
As we, as we look at our pull factor and we look at the transient guest tax and stuff, I know Bill Burke was fairly busy this weekend, and I notice it's been that way even with what we have, and I just think that's where right now we need to put our focus, and I think that'll help our transient guest tax and our hoteliers the way it is, and also take care of our scheduling for rainouts and those type of things. So, and I know, and we need to review that, because I know at one point we were talking about just doing infields at Bill Burke, or, do we want two, as I'll call them, premier diamonds that are completely turfed, because you can collect gate there. 4A was held there instead of at South High because you can't collect gate and stuff like that. So there may be some benefits to fully turfing 2 diamonds and having 4 or 6 diamonds that are just partially turfed too. So I think we need to have those discussions again with Parks and Rec. So
Yeah, the other thing I would tell you is more than ever, we struggled to hire part-time staff to, one of the duties is dragging and lining the ball field. So, Baseball Enterprises has advocated all along that there's efficiencies to be gained, and never disagreed with that. But now we're to the point that we struggle just to get the staff to drag and line the fields, and that's a hindrance for leagues on a daily basis out there, or could be anyway.
But I think we can at least address this and with the additional transient guest tax, I think we can fund what we need to do here. And that's without running the numbers. I'm just, as they say, spitballing it a little bit here, but I think we do have that ability. And then we can look at that next phase if we move to that, and not put as much, because I think that would be a lot to put on staff all at once, staff to try to do Bill Burke and, do East Crawford at the same time. So I think this could be beneficial, so.
Yeah, I would tell you one priority item at East Crawford is trying to deal with the runoff coming off that runway. I think I've had individual conversations with all of you. I can't explain the thinking of butting those fields right up against the edge of concrete, but we do need to get that drainage under control.
Okay.
I think that's helpful. That gives us a starting point, and we'll just need to confirm with you the allocation later in the study session presentation as well.
Okay, so the next 2 funds that we kind of look at, and these are pretty straightforward, just the Special Parks Fund with available funds of about $415,000. The list that's included here is those items that were identified through the tennis project initiative. Certainly, some of these are directly related to that project, and some of them are kind of ancillary to that project. I did note, too, that we did budget out of this fund $250,000 for mower replacements in 2021 because we were so in need of those replacements. We normally budget out of this fund for playground equipment, and it takes every bit of what we have in revenue to replace those playgrounds on an annual basis and on a consistent plan. The other one here is Special Gas Fund. Available is about $1.1 million. We have committed $900,000 of that, so there's not a lot of remaining funds in that balance there. I don't know if we want to talk about the tennis project detail items, or if we just want to bring that back later, Mike?
Yeah, I guess if you have feedback, that would be helpful. As Debbie said, we can support all that as described there. And then I think we just need to know going forward that Special Park Fund is going to be committed to trying to do 2 playgrounds a year and forever.
And-
You know, the number of playgrounds we have, the lifespan of a playground, the cost of it, we're probably will fall behind just a little bit. But if we dedicate this fund to park for playground equipment, we can come pretty close.
I know Kenwood Pool demo, we have to do because of the tennis. Why do we feel like we have to demo the Oakdale pool?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd rather that 70, it sits there. I don't see where it's bothering anything. I'd rather that 77,000 at this point went to something that if we had to do some maintenance.
And I may personally take responsibility for that one. I was just trying to clean up and get our
Yeah.
house in
I mean-
order.
Can that be filled in,
While we're at
frankly?
it, yeah.
Is
Well,
that
I'd agree the
completely
Oakdale
taking
courts
out all the
need to go.
concrete, or is that just filling it in?
Well, I know Arts and Humanities has some interest in retaining some of that concrete strategically for the River Festival and other uses, and we haven't got to that level of detail, but this was kind of a preliminary estimate. As it relates to the courts, and I think we talked about this before, but my thinking was if we just leave those courts there, then we have the remaining expectation that they should be pickleball courts or handball courts, or, we're leaving those because of the shape they're in and they're not able to be reconditioned. I just don't want to create a community expectation that it's an asset that we need to maintain and improve. The Oakdale pool, it sat there that way for a long, long time.
And if we don't have any, I was going to say concrete plan, but bad choice of words, but if there's no real plan for it, it is a big usable space.
Well, and
Well, there is
Yeah.
certainly interest in turning it into turf and the opportunity to redevelop it. I've kind of beaten back Arts and Humanities and their creative juices until we figure out whether we're going forward with this.
I have some ideas what could be done with it, but that would not be as urgent an issue as certainly as the reasoning that you just gave for the tennis courts.
Yeah, maybe I'm being overly frank, but we've had a handful of things that we've walked away from as a community and just left sit, the old pool being one of them, and so I was just trying to wipe the slate clean and get our house in order.
I will say this, I see people using that for a variety of things when I walk at Oakdale, especially in the summer months. A lot of times there's, people that have kids running around playing there, the occasional skateboard, which I know is not a good use for that, but that pool, and I don't know whether it's because of its size or its location or the art commission that's on that it's painted with, it seems to draw people there, and I see people, gathering around there and using it. So I think that we could find a better use for $77,000 within the park system until we have, as Commissioner Davis said, a concrete plan. That's mine.
Sounds like consensus to me.
Yeah,
Yep.
I agree. It's an interesting space.
And then, I guess, any demo that would be done on tennis courts, that's going to be a tremendous, to me, it would seem that would really open it up for the festival and for car shows, et cetera there, but you'd have to work out timing, I guess, on that a little bit in terms of getting new turf or new grass planted, and so you
Right.
don't have a mud pit for a.
Yeah, we've also talked about the electricity and making sure that we keep what we need there to make it available. So I think the thinking there is maybe a smaller footprint, but keeping some of that for the things that you described as well as River Festival. But yeah, we'd work through the timing of seeding it and getting the turf established. And so proceed, but keep the Oakdale pool. Okay?
Yep.
Keep the pool.
Keep the pool.
Cool.
Is there any chance to
All
respond?
right. Well, you and I can talk offline. I think there's alternatives, but what I'm hearing is you want more of a plan before we make that commitment.
So the next fund is the general fund, and that has about $4.2 million of available funding over the target balance. We are bringing a recommendation for your consensus to increase the general fund target fund balance to $10 million. That puts us more in the 20% range, and it gives us a little bit more cushion. So we're proposing that we take 1.5 million of that and leave it there and raise the target fund balance to 10 million. The following list are things that we've been recommending: the agenda software, the website, time and attendance, the grant coordinator. We are recommending that we set aside $1 million just as cushion for any pay plan implementation. We're recommending a facility audit on all of the city's facilities. And then we have a recommendation in here to replenish the Economic Development Fund, because with the Swans project, that is going to deplete that fund pretty low, which leaves about $670,000 out of the $4.2 million from the general fund, excess fund balance. So if we want to discuss those, that's probably about all we'll have time to discuss today.
And there's, $2.5 million of that is setting funds aside for the general fund and then the pay plan. And I should say the $1 million for the pay plan is a placeholder. There's not a lot of detailed math behind that until we get into the pay plan.
$1 million, not what it used to be.
You're definitely right about that. And as we discussed previously, that combined with that general fund balance might be a way for us to glide into revenue growth to support the pay plan.
Does that money get put in a separate account as far as you doing your budget every year, or is it?
Well, we've talked about quite a bit about unbudgeted reserve funds, so trying to be more dedicated about separate allocations for the purposes of accounting for that separately.
Probably for the pay plan, it would stay in that fund balance because it's not really a legitimate capital improvement fund. But it's probably pretty short-term, too, because we do have the pay plan going on, or we're starting that plan pretty quickly.
So when you put that $1 million, you're just putting that, I know, as a placeholder, but are you looking at that as a one-time adjustment? Tell me kind of how you came up with that.
Well, in the last time we did a pay plan, which was about 2006, the estimate for the cost increase was about $1 million. And then that estimate was low, and so we found ourselves having to try to find a way to catch up. So my thinking with $1 million is we still need to budget for the pay plan, but if we're off, then it's a balance to be drawn upon while we try to kind of refine our salary calculations and budgeting, and hopefully have revenue growth going forward to make up that gap. So kind of a balance to be drawn upon if the pay plan actual numbers exceed budget.
What does the facility audit encompass?
You want to touch that one, Jacob?
Yeah, so they'll just take a look at all of our facilities and make recommendations as far as our HVAC units, windows, energy efficiencies, those sorts of things. And then, so that audit will come back with a larger kind of capital improvement plan that we'll have to look at as we go. And we have over 100 HVAC units that are coming near the end of their usable life. I mean, there's just a lot of deferred maintenance on our facilities that we look at the parks and we look at the other things, but facilities is something that we kind of haven't really looked at. So we're going to try to get somebody on board to take a more in-depth look at what we have outstanding on those facilities.
I'm drawing a quick brain freeze here. Where is the EcoDevo fund money coming from right now?
Out of the sales tax.
That's what I thought. So this would be above and beyond what comes in annually.
Right. Well, if you recall, our annual amount that comes in from the sales tax, by the time we pay the EDO and SDI and some of those ongoing allocations, it's about a 1-for-1 right now. And so we aren't able to accumulate much of an additional balance.
So this won't help it on a yearly basis. It's
No.
truly a one-time
Right,
infusion.
this is a cash infusion.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and depending on what the facility audit shows, I mean, we might want to be kind of conservative budgeting that sales tax. All of a sudden, I'm thinking of, industrial air conditioning units and, new roofs and things like that.
Right.
Was there something done with Johnson Controls?
There was, yep. At the Law Enforcement Center, they came in and with upgrades and efficiencies, they said that our savings could pay for some of the improvements that were made there. And some of these facility audit firms, specialize in that as well.
Okay.
Yeah,
part of the-
they assist with the capital improvement planning, and they have programs that some of them actually even guarantee the energy savings and kind of set that to try and offset the cost. So I think with Johnson Controls in the last project we did, we kind of did the project and we didn't do anything forward, and it wasn't a long-term contract, so they didn't monitor it ongoing. Anything that we did in the future, we'd probably include some ongoing monitoring so that we can actually see what the savings are and go from there. So there's lots of programs out there, lots of firms that do it. We'll just have to see what we get. I'm working on the RFP right now, so hopefully in the next 2 or 3 months, we'll have somebody selected and move forward with that process.
And once this money goes to the EcoDevo fund, that's a one-way cash disbursement. It's,
Well, it's still our
Yes.
funds at our discretion, but it's
Right.
at least identified as being available for that purpose.
so that would be like the, which one is it? The pay plan implementation. So it's still in the general fund. So if we needed it, you could divert it elsewhere, just that for planning, we don't.
Sure. Much
Count
like the
those.
conversation you just had about streets and parks,
Yeah.
you'd still have some discretion.
Okay. That's right. I don't know why I was thinking that EcoDevo fund was in someone else's name, but it is
No,
actually.
Nope.
It's
Yeah.
our account. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
Brain fart. Okay. We have 5 minutes
Yes.
before we need to be back.
So,
Yeah.
yes, so I think, did we get almost as,
Were there any of those that you didn't want to see happen, or just in this general fund list, or change amounts, or
I
You're
think it
still on
reflects-
that page, 24? Yeah.
24? Yep.
Well, I don't know that other commissioners spoke to it, but I'm completely comfortable with the 20% target for the general fund. Mayor alluded to being conservative. I think having a little bit of cushion there is a wise idea.
Yep,
Yeah, sounds good to me.
fully agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll need to double back, but we kind of touched on baseball and 1.5 million. Is there general consensus around that? I'm jumping ahead to the next slide, but I know that there's going to be ongoing community conversation
Well,
about that one.
For me, yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay. That's helpful. Thank
Yeah.
you.
okay, all right.
So we'll come back next week and kind of do a little bit more detail on the ARPA funding and see where we want to kind of direct that, and then we'll bring back the comprehensive fee schedule next week also.
Thank you very much. We'll adjourn until 4 o'clock.
Thank you.
4